Well, Jim, let's get a few more questions and a few songs here on the show. This next one was sent to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Bill Wade. Hi, Jim. In the mid to late 70s, several of us would attend the weekly matches promoted by Nick Gulas in Chattanooga. One of my friends brought his sister along one night. We were standing in the hallway when George Gulas came up to her. For some reason, she gave him her number.
Uh-oh.
He bugged her until she agreed to go out with him. They dated a few times and eventually broke up. She told me some crazy things he would do, and most I did not believe. However, she said one of the strangest things she saw him do was to put his hand down his pants and then smell his fingers. I did not believe that a grown man would actually do that, and had forgotten the story until I read the Christine Jarrett book. In the book, it says that she and Jerry caught him doing that in the office in Nashville. Did you ever see George do any crazy things such as this?
Yeah, well, I started laughing when I heard that because I've heard that also. I did not spend a lot of time around George Gulas. I was a fan when he was wrestling in Louisville. I got his autograph on numerous occasions because he was the only one that would actually come out and stand there at the merchandise table and wait for people to ask him for his autograph. That was back before that was a thing. You didn't see unless you caught one of the guys coming in the back door and you waited out at the parking lot or whatever, or you caught him going to the concession stand to get a beer or a hot dog. You know, most of the time you didn't see it. But anyway, yes, I've heard that that's a thing that he would do. And I think I heard it from Teeny. And also, well, oh, George, into listening. Because by the time I got into business and started as a photographer, George didn't come to Louisville anymore. And that's what led to the split, because Jerry didn't want to book George in his end of the territory. But I also heard from Mike Duncan, who was the ring announcer in Louisville quite some time. He had done television for Nick back in the 70s. He was Teeny's nephew, and he'd been an announcer and like I said, did the TV. I think he did the TV for a while, not only in Nashville, but he also did either the Huntsville or Birmingham TVs at one point in time. Anyway, he told me the story that George was moving some furniture in his house and asked some of them to come over and help him move some stuff one day, and they went to move his old bed. And when they gripped it by the headboard, and they realized that evidently George used to lay in bed and pick his nose and reach up, and he had those long arms, and he'd wipe the boogers on the back of the headboard over his head. And there was a plethora. Some time it had taken to accumulate that amount of boogerage. But everybody also said George was a nice guy. And no, seriously, Bobby.
We just talked about him putting his hand down his pants and smelling his fingers and putting boogers everywhere, but he's a nice guy.
But he was a friendly guy, and he didn't get it like, one time they went on a trip and it was him and Bobby and I can't remember some of the other boys, right? And or maybe it was Frank Morrell told me that. Anyway, the point is, they would stop at a store to piss or whatever, get some beer or drink or a snack or whatever. And George would stop at the payphone and call Nick. Because when he just got into business, he was all thrilled and everything. He's like, yeah, Daddy, now we're on a road trip and now we stop to get some snacks. And now we going to go on to the town. And he's calling his dad to let him know about all these routine day-to-day things that everybody's doing. And meanwhile, they're like, what the fuck? This guy automatically is making more money than we are because he's the goddamn boss's son and he's being pushed into main events. We're having to drive him around and make sure he finds his way to the town. And now he's got to stop and call his dad and tell him how much fun we're having. And they got sandwiches one time. He said, we're going to have a picnic, Daddy. We're going to have a picnic. Yeah, we're having a picnic with bologna sandwiches because your dad won't pay us any more money so we can buy a fucking steak. So, but he didn't realize, it wasn't like he was an asshole or anything. He was just and I guess his dad had taught him or convinced him that he was going to be a major talent. As a matter of fact, David Williamson from down in Tennessee just sent me a DVD, and I had it on in the background while I was working in the action figure mines here a couple days ago. And it was the Continental show from Birmingham, Ron Fuller's Continental Wrestling show that they shot down in Alabama in 87 and 88. But it was on a Nashville station. WCAY, if that's even still a station. I think it's Channel 30 back in those days, but this was 1988. They got the Continental TV on in Nashville somehow, but they re-edited it, so it was the Continental program, but they had 2 local promo spots and an opening where it was the regular Continental opening, but somebody had taken and put in the very cheapest graphics that local TV stations ever use. It looks like the fucking game over on one of the early video games, that kind of font. Nick Gulas presents Continental Championship Wrestling. And then the first week of the show, they misspelled Gulas. It was Gulis instead of AS. Nick Gulas presents. And then there is Nick and George doing the local promos, announcing their spot shows that they had booked for Gulas World Wrestling. Gulas World Wrestling is coming back to Nashville, Tennessee, ladies and gentlemen. I know all of you have been asking, we've seen in the shopping malls and the grocery stores and all over the gas stations, when is Nick Gulas going to come back to professional wrestling in Nashville? The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is very soon. And here we are with Gulas World Wrestling, and we got a show, and they were advertising spot shows in like Lebanon, Tennessee, and somewhere else, and they were going to announce their big debut in Nashville, which they did finally by show number 5, and then the DVD froze up. But show number 5, they'd announced that brief time they started to run Nashville again at the National Guard Armory, which I think was a reason for Jerry Jarrett to do that angle where they brought Nick on their show
with Robert Fuller.
With Robert Fuller, because it was about that same time frame, but they didn't last but a couple months. But it was even then, and that was just a few years before Nick passed away, I think. But he was wanting to get back in wrestling, and George was convinced, and so was Nick, that just the name Nick Gulas in Nashville, even at that time, would instantly, all the wrestling fans would flock. And I mean, he was using Tojo, and Tojo was almost, to the end of his life, and poor Gypsy Joe, because he was local, and masked guys, and a girls boxing match. And I, as a matter of fact, I'm going to send you a copy of this DVD. You'll love the audio, because Nick does some of them, but he's having trouble with his voice. So he always used to have to do his local promos. That's how I grew up. The first local promos were Nick on Wednesdays in Nashville. They'd cut him for the whole territory. Even though he had different announcers, he had to do the local promos. And it sounded the same in that weird accent of his. Louisville Wrestling fans, Tuesday night show store for one of the biggest cards I've signed in many years, headlined by a return grudge NWA Southern Heavyweight Championship match with the champion, the fabulous Jackie Fargo, taking on the challenger, Jerry the King Lawler. In the studio with me right now, I got none other than Jackie Fargo. And Jackie, I know you had a bad time last week. And then he would go on the entire 2 minutes and 30 seconds of how that the babyface got screwed the previous week, and leave the babyface about 15 seconds to talk. And so Nick starts doing them, but then he's having problems with his voice. He must have had a cold. He starts, excuse me. And then we're going to have a 9-man battle royal. Excuse me. So then George does them for the next 3 weeks, and George is worse than Nick. I got to send these to you. You'd love it.
How would you explain that accent of his?
I don't know. He's Greek. Originally,
he wasn't born in Greece, was he?
Well, no, listen to me. Originally, his family is of Greek descent, but he was from fucking Birmingham. Nick Gulas, that's how he got in the business as a junior office boy in the Birmingham promotion back in the 30s. And then by the time, he met Roy Welch, they moved to Nashville and started the company. He was barely 30 years old back in the 40s, but he, in the 70s, he still talked like that. I tell you, boy, you got one of and he talked like a real old time, which he was 30s and 40s wrestling promoter, where he'd use that. Well, we got one of the top men in the nation coming in here, one of the top men in the nation. And even this was 1987, and George was reading off the notes of the card in La Follette, Tennessee, or whatever. He'd say, and we got one of the nation's top black mat stars. because that's the way they advertised him in the 60s. If Bearcat Brown came to a small town spot show in Alabama or Tennessee or whatever in the 60s, they would say, see live in person, one of the nation's top black mat stars. That make all the black fans come out. But they're doing it in 1987, right? And he wasn't even one of the nation's top black mat stars.
Who was it?
I can't even remember. That's some local guy. But that was the thing. That's one of the things that was fascinating about Nick Gulas' territory, is that Roy Welch started Southern wrestling in the 30s, right? Organized Southern wrestling pretty much. And Nick started in the business as the young kid who was the Birmingham promoter. Goddamn, what was his name? Now all the Tennessee wrestling historians will kill me. But he started as an office boy for him. And a lot of the boys used to tell me when I got into business that what warped Nick was when he was the office boy for the Birmingham promoter, that he would have to ride to the towns in those big old cars, those old gangster cars like on the Untouchables, where you get 5 grown men in the back seat, right? And they'd make him ride in the fucking floorboard, and they'd piss on him and throw their fucking beer bottles on him and everything, because he was just the office boy. So then he ended up, after he got hooked up with Roy Welch, became the promoter. He owned the whole thing. And he was, to the end, he was wanting to fuck those guys back for fucking him around. But it was a time capsule territory, because you actually got to see the methods of promotion, the verbiage, the angles, the finishes that were done in the 40s and 50s. In the formative days of territory wrestling, things were still being done that way because it was still the same people in charge, and it was still drawn. It was different wrestlers. They didn't do like the Sheik did and just you keep the same crew, but it was the same promotional tactics, the same kind of stipulations, the same verbiage. They continued it and Jerry Jarrett had learned from Roy Welch, so he continued that in a lot of cases, even more updated though, but in his company, and it was fascinating. It was at the essence of how you get people involved in personal issues. And that was one of the differences in styles in the territories, where the WWF in the Northeast was the big monster heel challenging the ethnic babyface. In the Carolinas, they had made it where it was the working territory, especially in the 70s with the expansion, where all the best in-ring workers and the most professional-looking athletes. And then there was the craziness in the Midwest with the Bruiser and Sheik and the Crusher and brawls and blood. And in Tennessee, it was personal issues, even between guys that didn't even look like wrestlers, but you could believe that they were. Ron Wright didn't look like a fucking wrestler. People were trying to shoot him. They stabbed him. They burned his planes. Because the Tennessee, the Southern promoters made you believe in the people instead of the business, and got shit tons of heat on the heel so that the hero could be a real hero when he vanquished him. So they're all fighting and hitting each other with chairs and shit, not like today where they cooperate. I had a line here on the show recently people liked. I said, they had a fight where the furniture got in the way. They didn't help each other set the furniture up so they could fall through it. But there was blood and heat and personal issues, and that really never changes. So the same things, the same style of things worked in the 70s as worked in the 40s, and it was fascinating to see. That's where wrestling was always different. Wrestling always had different styles all over the country and different methods of promotion. But the one thing that was constant is they didn't fucking let you know they were pulling your leg, yanking your chain. It was real, just whatever they had decided the flavor of real was in that part of the country.